story of the B-36 is unique in American aviation history. It survived near cancellations on 6 separate occasions and was the symbol of a bitter inter-service rivalry between the newly formed Air Force and the well-established Navy over who would control delivery of atomic weapons during the early years of the Cold War, and consequently, who would receive the lion's share of the defense budget. In early 1941, with World War II raging in Europe, the United States Army Air Corps, or USAC, had concerns regarding the range of its bomber force. With the fall of Britain still a potential reality, it would require a bomber with transcontinental capability and sufficient range to strike targets in Europe from bases in Newfoundland. To fill this need, it issued specifications for a very long-range bomber in 1941. Only 2 contractors picked up this challenge, Consolidated and Boeing. After a brief design competition, Consolidated won the development contract, ultimately designating the project XB-36. Consolidated promised a prototype within 30 months, with a second to follow 6 months later. This timetable soon was disrupted by the United States' entry into World War II. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Consolidated was ordered to slow the project in favor of focusing on the production of the B-24 Liberator. The size and power of the airplane can only be described with words like huge and enormous. Given the normal reaction of people who first viewed the prototype, many had taken to calling it the Jesus airplane. The B-36 commanded awe from all who saw and heard it. Everything about the B-36 was larger than life and difficult to describe. The sheer scope and size of the plane were only matched by the press releases and propaganda unleashed by the Air Force and Convair. To keep the media frenzy alive and the Soviets nervous, Convair then announced the B-36 would carry its own defensive jet fighters, as many as 4, inside its massive bomb bays. The relentless propaganda campaign was an unqualified success. The Army Air Forces effectively used the B-36 to intimidate the Soviet Union even before the first operational airplane had been delivered. During its brief but breathtaking career, the B-36 never fired a shot in anger. But that doesn't mean it wasn't successful on its mission of deterrence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In truth, the fact that it never fired a shot or dropped a bomb may prove just how successful the program was. However, with advances in technology and the advent of jet interceptors capable of reaching high altitude, such as the MiG-15, the B-36's brief career came to a close. Assessing American needs after the Korean War, President Dwight D. Eisenhower directed resources to the Strategic Air Command, which allowed for the accelerated replacement of the B-29s with the B-47s, as well as large orders of the new B-52 Stratofortresses to replace the B-36s. As the B-52s began entering service in 1955, large numbers of the B-36s were retired and scrapped. By 1959, the B-36 had been removed from service. The history of the B-36 is indelibly tied to Fort Worth, Texas, and to the plant that produced it, officially known as Government Aircraft Plant 4. And you can't mention Fort Worth, Texas, without talking about its biggest booster and champion, Amon G. Carter. Carter was the owner and publisher of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He abided a great love of Fort Worth and selfless philanthropy, a near obsession with aviation, and a deep-seated disdain for neighboring Dallas, the larger, more metropolitan city 30 miles to the east. The Star-Telegram and Carter's influence stretched far and wide. In 1936, an article in the Amarillo Globe read, "West Texas is bound on the north by Colorado and Oklahoma, on the west by New Mexico, on the south by Mexico, and on the east by Amon Carter." But Carter's power and influence stretched well beyond West Texas. In fact, his power could not be ignored even in Washington, D.C. In 1939, President Roosevelt described American military air power as utterly inadequate and requested Congress to provide $300 million for the purchase of 3,000 aircraft for the Army. However, due to the seemingly invincible air power and anti-aircraft capabilities of Nazi Germany, it seemed heavy losses of the aircraft and crew were inevitable. So these projects skyrocketed, and Roosevelt ordered production of 50,000 aircraft. American aircraft producers were woefully unprepared to meet this capacity, leading the federal government to establish the Defense Plant Corporation, which provided funds to private companies to enable them to build or expand plants. Fearing a possible attack by Japan, Roosevelt proclaimed a zone of the interior that was 200 miles within the coast and borders of the United States. The War Department ordered all new defense plants to be built inland. Consolidated Aircraft was founded by Reuben Hollis Fleet in 1923. Consolidated had 2 aircraft, the PBY Catalina, an amphibious patrol airplane, and the B-24 bomber that would prove essential to the war effort. Fleet needed an inland location adjacent to a lake to build his new assembly plant. Carter had become acquainted with Fleet during his frequent flights on Pan American World Airways and was determined Fort Worth would be Consolidated's new location. However, this was not the only connection Carter had at his disposal. In 1939, Jesse Holman Jones was appointed head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and in 1940, head of the Defense Plant Corporation. Carter and Jones had been friends and political allies since the 20s. Roosevelt gave Jones the authority to spend up to $500 million without the approval of the President or Congress. The freedom to spend such large sums of money with little to no government oversight earned Jones the reputation of being the fourth branch of government. Lastly, President Roosevelt's daughter, Anna, and son, Elliot, both lived in Fort Worth, and FDR became a frequent visitor to the city. So Carter was well connected to lure his aircraft plant, and because Fort Worth was home to an Army aircraft training base in World War I, it already had the required infrastructure. Consolidated, however, seemed more interested in Fort Worth's rival to the east, Dallas. Site surveyors from Consolidated arrived in Dallas on November 1939 and identified a site located west of Hensley Reserve Airfield on Mountain Creek Lake, which appeared to meet all their requirements. An agreement was reached between Consolidated